Good morning and welcome to Hudson Institute here in DC. We are a research organization dedicated to promoting American leadership for a secure, free, and prosperous future. My name is Jeremy Hunt. I'm a media fellow here, and I have the honor of moderating a discussion about facing the future, a discussion on Niger and West African security cooperation. We have with us Yahaya Ibrahim of International Crisis Group, Malik Samuel of Institute for Security Studies, former U.S. State Department advisor and stabilization advisor, in particular, Aneliese Bernard. And we also have Hudson's very own research fellow, James Barnett, here as well. And I want to start first, and we'll start with you, James, just kind of opening up a discussion for us on exactly what has been going on, kind of a high level overview of what has happened in Niger for folks who are maybe not are specialists in this area. Can you kind of just give some background? Why are we seeing these headlines of U.S. troops being forced to pull out, and kind of what are the implications for the entire kind of West African region as a whole?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy. I'll try to keep this as a pretty high level overview because I'm very fortunate that I have three incredibly knowledgeable co-panelists who can dive into a lot more detail on some of the different facets. But to kind of describe things broadly over the course of the past decade, West Africa has seen, unfortunately, a real expansion of Salafi jihadist groups throughout kind of what's known as the Sahel region. So the area kind of incorporating the southern edges of the Sahara, going through West Africa, and kind of beginning in the late 2000s and early 2010s, insurgent movements originally linked mostly to Al-Qaeda that had been very kind of operational in Algeria, and those countries were starting to push south into Mali in particular, because of Mali's destabilization in 2012, linked to both a coup within the country as well as the broader the NATO intervention in Libya and kind of spillover from that. So since the early or kind of mid 2010s, the Mali in particular had kind of been the epicenter of this growing, metastasizing kind of Salafi jihadist crisis within the West Africa region that eventually spread across five Sahelian countries in particular, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and then to some extent as well, kind of Chad and Nigeria. Although, as I think Malik can provide in more detail, the insurgencies in Nigeria have been a bit distinct from those happening in kind of these other kind of Sahelian West African countries. So beginning also in the mid 2010s, starting with a French military intervention and then supported later by kind of US forces and EU military missions, as well as a broader UN peacekeeping mission, the region started to see a lot of international kind of security assistance, including direct military interventions, as I mentioned, typically kind of or spearheaded initially by the French. And these interventions, you can get into a lot more detail about the kind of strengths and weaknesses about them, some of the operational victories, but overall, strategically, the picture kind of continued to get worse in most of the region throughout the Sahel. The U.S. role in this was originally, or it kind of evolved at different phases. American forces typically weren't as engaged in some of the kind of direct counterterrorism operations as the French were in terms of kind of, say, boots on the ground. Although there were some kind of incidents earlier on or some phases in which U.S. Special Operations Forces were accompanying local militaries in their kind of efforts to build capacity and stuff. We're actually engaging and supporting these militaries as they went out on raids, which notably led to a tragic incident in Niger, particularly in the area of Tongo Tongo in October 2017, after which the U.S. forces kind of reverted to a slightly more kind of, I wouldn't say hands-off posture, but being engaged more in kind of training and providing ISR. So that's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to both the French forces in the region as well as to some of these local militaries that the United States was helping build the capacity of, along with the EU and others. So to kind of bring it into the Niger in particular, Niger had been where the United States had kind of invested in some ways some of its most substantial kind of defense and security resources for a number of reasons. Part of it being kind of the geographic location of the country, and particularly for the construction of these drone bases, the most notable one being in Agadez. It provides a lot of coverage of the broader Sahel region. This is a really vast region. It's one thing that to keep in mind when talking about counterterrorism there is that this is, a much larger territory than, say, Afghanistan, which, of course, U.S. forces had a tremendous amount of trouble pacifying or controlling, and so the French were doing so with even fewer forces over a broader territory. So part of it was the geographic region or benefits of Niger. Part of it as well was kind of this the idea that Niger was in some ways it was a frontline state, but it was also largely dealing with spillover from other countries, and so maybe in to some extent there was an opportunity to kind of be more proactive and rather than kind of having to deal with the problem in the very heart of a kind of the insurgency, which throughout much of the 2010s was Mali, and then shifted more into kind of the Mali, Burkina, Niger tri-border region. That there would be some benefits to, or that there would be some advantages to trying to kind of monitor and contain the threat from Niger. And then also, especially in the past few years, Niger's kind of value again was also seen in the political sphere because whereas Mali and Burkina Faso fell to successive coups since 2020, Niger remained with a democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum, and so there was the sense as well that kind of the U.S. Wouldn't need to contradict as much its values while also pursuing these security interests in the region. The challenge is that, of course, that's kind of the broad level. That was the broad level thinking, and to some extent, I think the justification for the engagement in Niger. But things were not quite so simple in practice. And even taking, for example, kind of a look into Niger's politics, which is not really an area where I'm an expert on. So I'm going to let Ibrahim talk about more about that there. But Bazoum was someone who had a lot of political rivals. His democratic credentials and kind of by extension his broader popular legitimacy were not without question in terms of some of the conduct of the last elections and stuff. And then more broadly, there's been this kind of broader wave of frustration with civilian leaders in West Africa that I think we see most acutely in the Sahelian states because they're the ones battling these biggest insurgencies. But we see it more broadly elsewhere across coastal West Africa and Nigeria and in Ghana and Benin, frustrations with kind of civilian administrations that are seen as that they're purportedly democratic, but not by any means consolidated democracies, and are very often have serious issues with corruption, with kind of accountability, responsiveness to their citizens, and such. And so there's maybe a broader debate about the extent to which there was kind of a domino effect or a coup contagion, as some analysts have called it, in the Sahelian region. But beginning and I should note that these many of these countries have prior histories of coups dating back to independence in the 1960s, but just specifically looking at this period of kind of the late 2010s onwards, when Mali and Burkina Faso experienced coups and these juntas came to power, one of the things that they were able to, and there were proximate triggers to each kind of the coups in each country. But one of the things that they were able to kind of capitalize on were these popular frustrations with the civilian leaders, and especially the kind of perceptions that France possessed kind of inordinate neo-colonial degrees of influence over these countries, which had once been its colonies. And so particularly the kind of political ties between the civilian political elite and the French lent and the to the very large kind of influence that France has politically and also economically in many of these countries led to kind of these coups taking on an anti-French flavor, more anti-French than anti-American, I'd say, but in some ways, and this certainly brings us to the issue in Niger. There's a question about how much the U.S. could distinguish itself from the French, and how much the narratives of the juntas would try to kind of or the I guess the extent to which the juntas would kind of distinguish between the two in terms of security partners and such. But so the reason I think, beyond the fact that Niger was just the latest country in West Africa to fall to a coup, the reason that this coup that in July 2023 kind of sparked, I think, so much international attention. And I should also note that to the extent information is available, the coup was not necessarily something that had been planned kind of long in the works. It was not something that was orchestrated by foreign powers like Russia, although Russia has been eager to try to exploit it. It really kind of was in some ways a result of rivalries within or kind of rivalries between the presidency and specific generals within the security sector, ambitions and grievances from a number of generals in particular. So this coup kind of, even though the structural conditions maybe were there for the coup, it did, I think, take a number of observers by surprise. Um, and there was a real sense that, well, okay, after Mali and Burkina Faso, Niger was kind of supposed to be the holdout, right? And it's not just because, well, it's the remaining civilian-led government and it's where the U.S. forces are, but to a real extent, and this is backed up by the data. Whereas jihadist groups had been kind of very quickly expanding throughout most of West Africa, Niger in certain areas was seeing a bit more modest progress. It was certainly not, I mean, there's a whole debate to be had about the future trajectory, the sustainability of some of these programs and stuff. But Bazoum was taking a more calibrated approach, one that I think Aneliese can speak to in some ways, particularly regarding issues such as, encouraging disarmament and demobilization of insurgents, kind of localized negotiations with some of these insurgent movements. So he was taking in some ways not just a military, but also a political approach to these issues, one that was actually kind of more calibrated and less focused on just the heavy seeing nails and being a hammer kind of approach that the military regimes, say in Mali and Burkina Faso, since 2020 have been very much kind of shifting in that direction. So there was also, in the view of many analysts, myself included, the coup was beyond just the question of okay, or setting aside the question of the geopolitics and U.S. influence versus Russian or French influence and all that stuff. Just looking at the actual facts on the ground, it seemed that this junta has that came to power in July and consolidated its influence over the course of the summer. That it was going to kind of do away with some of the what a lot of observers viewed as the more productive kind of elements of counterinsurgency and stabilization. It was going to adopt a more kind of narrow militaristic lens to dealing with the jihadist issue. And then also simultaneously, as military regimes typically do, both in West Africa, but really the world over, unsurprisingly, they use a lot of their military and security resources for regime security. And so there have been reports since the coup of some very elite units being pulled off the front lines to go to the capital in Niamey to provide security, given uncertainty over if there's going to be another coup. There's a whole other issue that I was writing about quite a lot last summer, but in the interest of time, don't have much kind of space to go into. But there was a whole issue of a potential or a threat of a military intervention from the regional bloc, ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, that again kind of internationalized what was happening in Niger, brought it in some ways into this kind of apparent division between a kind of Russian-backed junta bloc and a Western-backed ECOWAS. The reality, I think, was a bit more complex, but maybe Ibrahim can talk a bit about that. But what essentially happened over the course of the summer was, these ECOWAS states led largely by Nigeria, and I think with a lot of support from France, not as much from the U.S., but certainly from France, were kind of threatening that to actually launch a military intervention. They issued an ultimatum to the junta saying, if you don't step down and cede power back to a civilian administration, if you don't release President Bazoum, who to this day is in captivity, that they will launch a military intervention to restore democracy. And my own read on this, kind of looking at it more from the Nigerian angle, was I think that there was an expectation that the junta would fold, that they would, in that early chaotic period, that they would be sufficiently afraid of an intervention that they would restore Bazoum's leadership. It turns out they were very afraid of an intervention, but actually what they did instead was, I think they consolidated their power. They very quickly made it clear to the French that they needed the French military out of there, that they were going to kick them out, and they turned kind of haltingly to Russia. At least they made some initial overtures or received some overtures from Russia, and so they were looking for external support, and particularly, I should say, more so than Russia, from the neighboring juntas in Mali and Burkina Faso. So the junta essentially successfully stared down this threat of an invasion. The 10-day ultimatum passed. Then it was a kind of looser ultimatum after that. ECOWAS has had some pretty strict economic sanctions in place that persisted for several months. But I'd say that by September it was pretty clear that there wasn't going to be a military intervention in Niger. I mean, among other things, it wasn't feasible given the state of the kind of ECOWAS militaries, if you will. And so the U.S. position since then, that kind of leads up, and I'll try to wrap up here quickly, but the U.S. kind of policy from, say, roughly August or September of last year up until where we are now was a bit more calibrated, and I would say more pragmatic, more realist, than, say, the policy of France, which was very intent on trying to restore Bazoum to power. They were, very hardline in their demands and such, quite uncompromising. And not without reason in terms of specifically Bazoum's health and safety, which the junta has been, very reckless about, even threatening at points to execute Bazoum. But the United States took a more pragmatic approach and essentially was hoping that, through various forms of kind of inducement, negotiations, that they could make some arrangement where the junta would agree to some sort of timetable to restore civilian rule that would eventually allow for the United States to provide some degree of security assistance. It got very complicated, as Aneliese can explain, with what's called Section 7008, which is a law that the United States cannot provide direct assistance to militaries that engage in, coups or kind of overthrow democratic regimes. So there's a lot of kind of details you can get in the weed there about the negotiations, but the general approach was one of kind of trying to see if they couldn't meet halfway somehow through some sort of gradual transition. Maybe the United States could keep up some forms of security assistance even while others were suspended under 7008. And then to take us back to kind of the past month or so, all of this came kind of unraveled very quickly. And I think to some extent, I'm going to let Ibrahim and Aneliese discuss more about that. But the reports that we have now are, at least from the perspective of the Nigerians who have been speaking out a bit more about this, members of the junta, that's called the CNSP, known by its acronym, that they've kind of accused the United States of taking a very kind of maximalist, bullying or even condescending tone, and essentially shifting from the more pragmatic approach that they'd had over the initial few months after the coup to kind of a more Cold War style. You have to do what you want, what we want, or you don't get our aid. You can't work with Russia. You can't. There were reports I don't know the validity of these reports, but about possibly the Nigerians talking with with the Iranians about a uranium deal and such. So it kind of seems that after some initial months of more pragmatic, I wouldn't say that there was progress in the negotiations, but there was at least things were kind of at a certain equilibrium. Very quickly they unraveled, with the Nigerians, like I said, pointing fingers at the Americans for kind of for bungling this, for being bullying, for being condescending, and for not understanding their own leverage. So that's kind of the position we're in now. There's a question of, is the U.S. going to try to salvage some sort of security cooperation? Though the reports from the past few days indicate that the junta has made it pretty clear that they want the American forces to leave. And so there's a question of, is the U.S. going to try to reposition drones in a country like Cote d'Ivoire, which is a coastal West African state that's, the government is pretty pro kind of friendly to France, friendly to the U.S., already has some existing security cooperation. My own view on that, for whatever it's worth, is that I think that there are many more parallels between Niger on the eve of its coup and Ivory Coast today than we might like. And so there's a tremendous amount of risk, and probably not worth it, in my view, to try to reposition these drones to other countries that have kind of similar structural factors. But again, I think I hope I've been able to cover kind of the high level stuff,
Yeah.
and I'm very eager to hear what my panelists have to say in more detail.
I appreciate that, James, kind of laying that out for us and also kind of giving us some of what's on the table in terms of options going forward. I want to zoom in for a second, and Ibrahim, I would like to get you in on this, just kind of talking a little bit more about the junta's logic, kind of what have been kind of its primary aims since taking power in 2023, and how has it responded to outside pressure?
Thank you very much for this, and thanks, James, for really laying the ground for this discussion. I think you covered a lot of ground already. So the junta has made so far a lot of decisions that feel as if they are irrational decisions. But I would like to emphasize a few points that would help us really at least shed some lights on some of the posture that they have, particularly the relation with this divorce, if you can call it that, with the United States. particularly in terms of asking the military in the U.S. to withdraw. I mean, divorce is a big term because the U.S. has decided to maintain its engagements, development and humanitarian engagement. But in terms of the presence of the U.S. troops in Niger, the transitional authorities have been adamant in asking for that withdrawal, and they came to an agreement with the U.S. That this agreement will be achieved by September of this year. So how do you understand those? I think there are a few things that we have to take into account. The first one is the lack of trust. James, you mentioned that the U.S. took a pragmatic approach after the coup, in contrast with many other actors in the international community, including France, many European countries, including a regional force like ECOWAS, took a very hard position from the beginning of the coup, imposing sanctions and even threatening to intervene militarily in Niger. But the United States took a different stance to say that, first of all, by not calling it a coup. They took 2 months before they acknowledged that a coup happened in Niger, because, as you mentioned, James, acknowledging that a coup happened will impose the government to take other decisions, including restricting the development aid, security cooperations, etc. So, despite that pragmatic approach, I think the junta did not trust that the United States will support their grab of power. And also the US did not do that because they believed, they did actually took that approach thinking or hoping that they will induce the junta to turn back power, to depose the President Bazoum, or at least to accept a minimal term of transition and return power to the democratically elected government. So at no time, both those leaders, both those countries, the junta on one side and the US, never trusted that they would have a constructive collaboration in the longer term. That distrust, lack of trust between the two was there from the beginning. Now, after that, there was other things that exacerbated this lack of trust. We remember in October, the junta alleged that Bazoum tried to escape from custody. Now, in the scenario that was laid in the media, and when you talk to people close to the junta, they said that there wasn't a helicopter that was supposed to take Bazoum off. When he escaped from the presidency, there was a helicopter. And many within the junta believed that that helicopter was an American helicopter. And they hinted at that in the statement that they put out after the failure of the negotiations in March, when Malik was there discussing with them. And if you follow in between the line, you realize that grievance that they mentioned about the role that they accuse, I don't know if they accuse the government or some US interest of playing in that escape. And that has deepened. Really, many people within the junta and around them believe that the US has played some role in that escape thing. Second thing, and it is related to that, is paranoia. And this is a big thing. The junta knows that the divorce with France didn't go well. As you mentioned, there was anti-French sentiment. They ended up by breaking. France closed its embassy. The embassy was attacked by mobs in Niger. And there were tough languages that were exchanged between the two. The junta accused France of being behind the threat by ECOWAS to intervene militarily, etc. And up to today, many within the junta and their supporters believe that the France is somewhere, trying to organize something to destabilize the regime. You have all the time anecdotes about, somebody somewhere, a French colonel at some border with Chad or with Nigeria, trying to train. I mean, you have all those conspiracy theories about France trying to come back and destabilize the regime. Recently, they mentioned that that's the prime minister saying that in Benin, in northern Benin, French have positions across the border, several positions. They talk about 5 different positions that put Niger a threat, of some sort of intervention by France. I mean, of course, there is very little to support those arguments, but at least many people believe that at some point, I mean, there is somewhere France trying to destabilize. And they also believe that if France is to do anything against Niger, they don't trust the United States to support them against France in whatever France would do. So you have that. Hence, they think that, I mean, the only superpower that can help them to alleviate any antagonistic move by France is Russia. Hence, all this, effort to try to strengthen links with Russia. Hence, the buying of the anti-air system. I mean, anti-air system is not to fight jihadists. Jihadists do not have aircrafts. The reason why they are buying, they are spending the little resources that the government has to have those anti-aircrafts is because they believe that this is crucial for the survival of the regime, because in case anything might happen, it might happen from the air. If France is to intervene in Niger or ECOWAS or France via ECOWAS, the weakness is the protection of their aerial system. So that's why they went there to purchase those anti-aircraft system. Now, the third thing is populism. You have for any junta, the biggest dilemma is how do you legitimize yourself in power? Because there is no election. It's a power that you grab by force, by the power of guns. And how do you legitimize yourself? Here, legitimacy, popularity is one thing that they are playing from the beginning, trying to make the public content with the decision that they are making. Some of those tough decisions that they make, including vis-a-vis the United States, are very popular. People have been really fed up with international community, taking charge in their countries. And now what the junta is saying that we give back power we take over. We are in charge now. Nigerians are in charge of their destiny. It's not the international community that is imposing, things upon us. We are taking charge, and this has given back people dignity, and this is very popular. So this populistic popularity has supplanted legitimacy, if you want, in Nigeria, in the way that they play it around. And this has been very helpful for them so far in public opinion. And the third, and I will end by that, I think is, which is deeper. I think there is some doctrinal things related to that, particularly to the foreign troops' presence in Niger. Sovereignty is not a new term in Niger or in the region at large. The first coup that we had, which was in 1974, made by Kunche, was also based on sovereignty. The first thing that Kunche did, or one of the first decisions that he made after he did the coup, was to expel a French French troops, was to expel French troops from Niger. They had a troops that they maintained from before independence, up to 1974. And at that time, the main argument that he put forward was, we are regaining our sovereignty and we will not tolerate any foreign military presence in the country. And, up to today, within the high-ranking officers in the army, there are people who believe in that, who believe that our sovereignty means that we do not accept any foreign military presence in the country. Now, the army today, within the high-ranking officers, you have a constant debate between this side of the old, the vanguard within the army, and you have younger officers who have seen value in the collaboration that the officers have had with foreign troops, including the Americans who trained thousands and thousands of special forces, the equipments that they gave, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, etc. People who have, particularly the younger officers, who have seen value in that, have been in support of having some form of foreign troops. So there have been a lot of debate within the military between those two clashing views, whether it is a good thing to have foreign military or not. But from all that we see today, is that the first one have won the debate. The vanguard, those who believe that we do not need any foreign military presence. Now, you can say that there is some, contradiction, because we say that we don't want the US, US troops in Niger, but at the same time, you are inviting the Russians. But the way that these people believe, or the way that they see it, is that Russians is a transactional thing. It doesn't undermine our legitimacy. We pay service for money. We give them money so that they could intervene here, and that's it. They are not asking us to, to set a term limit to respect freedoms and human rights, etc., etc. They do not have any interaction, imposition that they force upon us. And that's the difference. For them, it's not affecting their sovereignty, but you can debate that. I mean, you can say that, well, I mean, this is only the beginning of it. We can see when the Russians settled down in Central African Republic, I mean, they have really undermined the country's sovereignty, but it is not the way that people see it. So I know that I have talked a lot. I can come back on the second side of the question, which is what is... I think you asked about what is a view forward. How is that going to end? But I'm happy to answer that at later stage.
Okay, yeah, we'll circle back and just kind of we'll kind of go around the panel, just kind of get everyone's thoughts on kind of what's next. Malik, I would like to get you in the conversation. Just to talk a little bit about, can you speak in more detail about the ramification on counterterrorism cooperation among West African states in particular? Kind of what I think about how Nigeria is literally essentially 10 times more populous than Niger, and obviously has a very kind of porous border with Niger. So what does that look like in the situation with all the with the junta in charge of Niger and the relationship with Nigeria, and then just kind of in general security cooperation among all the states in West Africa?
Thank you. So I think the problem is bigger, I think, than people realize, both in the short time, the midterm, and also in the long term, unless there's a solution found around the political situation in Niger, because Niger is very strategic, is very important in the fight against violent extremist groups in the region, especially Boko Haram. And so when you talk about the ramification, one thing that comes to mind easily is in the area of coordination. Niger holds Sector 4 of the Multinational Joint Task Force, which is the regional army that is empowered to fight Boko Haram. And the MNJTF is present, has sectors in Nigeria, in Niger, in Chad, and in Cameroon. One important aspect of this MNJTF is coordination, which is done in Chad at the force headquarters. But Niger withdrew, though not officially, withdrew from the MNJTF. And I remember James mentioned earlier about troops being moved, from certain areas to Niamey. This also happened, where troops that were supposed to man the office, the MNJTF Sector 4, rather moved to the state and to the capital of the country, that's Niamey. Now, what that has done is that there is no coordination. The critical role that Niger should play in the MNJTF, that role is no longer available to the MNJTF. The sector commander there no longer reports to the force commander in Chad. And if you know that the force commander is usually in Nigerian, so that talks about the relationship between Nigeria, and Niger. And I think a few days ago, I saw the force commander actually complaining about the role that Niger should play, that it is not playing because of the political situation. One of the problem manifests in the area of say movement of fighters across borders. Now, Niger shares border. I think the Niger has border of 7 countries in the Sahel and West Africa, but Nigeria is the longest, where you have 7 states bordering the country. Now, in terms of logistics, these violent extremist groups, especially Boko Haram, rely a lot on Niger for logistics and supply. Even if these logistics are coming from Nigeria, it has to pass through Niger as a way of avoiding detection. So it has to pass through Niger and then crosses into Nigeria, for the guys around the lake, the Boko Haram factions, around the lake to access. And before then, even the MNJTF, they also rely on Niger to get certain logistics. It was easier when the cooperation was before the coup. It was easier for them to go into a Difa or close by to get some of the logistics that some of the supplies that they need. But right now, it's not possible. They have instead of just easily crossing into Niger and getting what they need, now they have to come all the way into Nigeria, which is a longer distance. So that coordination, it's a big problem. And the counterterrorism conference that recently happened in Abuja, ordinarily Niger should be there, but Niger was not there. I understand that Nigeria wanted Niger to be there. But I think ECOWAS or other partners didn't want that as a way of not legitimizing the juntas. So Niger should be there, but Niger was not there. And so you look also at the critical role that the US should be playing while it was if it was still in Niger. I'll use the word was, even though we know they will be pulling out by September. That support that the US should be providing to not just to Niger, but to countries fighting violent extremist group, that will be taken away, especially in the area of intelligence, sharing. So the freedom of movement that these groups will have, I think it's one of it's a big problem for counterterrorism in the region. And I think it was James who also mentioned before the coup, apart from the military operations, there was also political and non-kinetic effort that were being carried out in the region, and Niger was important in that, especially in the area of DDR. But right now, nobody knows how much of that is happening. Niger and Nigeria used to have the most advanced DDR programs in the region. But right now, it's just Nigeria. Nobody knows what is happening in Niger, and that is because nobody has real information about what is happening there, and that is a big problem because you have a lot of these fighters wanting to come out. They're looking for exit pathways. So if these exit pathways are not available in Niger, it is a problem. So that is something that I think this political situation in Niger, has caused, especially when you talk about counterterrorism. So what I wanted to point out specifically is the fact that these 4 countries right now don't have the support or the critical contribution that Niger should be bringing to the table, and that is a big problem, in the fight against Boko Haram.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that, Malik. And Aneliese, I would like to get you in the conversation here and just kind of talking a little bit about from the United States perspective, what has the U.S. lost in Niger, and what needs to change in terms of U.S. policy towards regions in light of these developments? And then also at some point, I would love to also hear just kind of what you would say. Is there anything that you would have done differently in approaching the region?
It's a very loaded question. So what the United States has lost. The US has been invested in the Sahel region for over a decade at this juncture, in West Africa, obviously, for longer than that. But Niger really was put on this pedestal within State Department as kind of the, not just the favorite partner, but the one that had benefited the most in many ways from really structured, coordinated development, diplomacy, and defense spending from the US government. To the extent that when I was in Niger from 2017 to 2019, I actually arrived right after the Tango attack. And it was, a very rich talking point, both within Congress, but also within, our, public policy outreach, and also within the embassy itself, that this is our favorite and most trustworthy partner in the region. So what that means is that moving forward, the US has really lost what I think would be an anchor of a friendship in the region in many ways. But in terms of lessons learned and what could have been done better, there's a lot of truth that needs to be had from those belief systems. And I do think it speaks to a lack of ground truth in how the US had its relationship, not just in Niger, but in a lot of these countries. There tends to be this mentality that because they are such positive receivers of the aid that we're giving, that therefore they are this trustworthy, anchored relationship, and that it really does transcend just being a beneficiary of all of this aid. In truth, I think that speaks to hubris and frankly lazy diplomacy on the US government's part in terms of not really getting a more broader sense, going outside of their safety zone, talking to other people in Niger, both within the government, but also at the civil society level, to get a much broader sense of how people really perceive the US government. And I think that this is actually a trend on not just a Sahel and then also coastal West Africa level, but also more globally speaking right now. We're seeing this with, the US relationship and response towards Gaza. Obviously, in the aftermath of Afghanistan, there is a global growing sense that the US has really not recalibrated its approach since the end of the Cold War, which again relies on not just laziness, but also hubris, and that the US is the preferred partner in many ways. And I think that this means that the US government needs to take a much more recalibrated approach to how it engages locally. There's little efforts right now, for example, in coastal West Africa through a lot of the USAID programming to do a bigger emphasis on localization, but there's not really a true understanding of what localization actually means. There's a variety of ways by which USAID individually through its various implementing partners might deploy a localized approach to programming, but it still comes off as a very, a copy and paste version of what the US was doing already in the Sahel for the past few years, with very few actual lessons learned there. So I think just on a broader sense, there's a lot of lessons learned, both in terms of ground truthing, what the actual needs are on the ground, and also responding to what the government needs at the very top. That's another thing that was a huge problem with the Sahel. We did quite a bit of decentralization programming, particularly in Niger, and it did not exactly speak to what the political elites and what was going on at the very top. And I think because of that, you have, this NGOification of US government programming and engagement bilaterally with these countries that again becomes kind of like a incomprehensive, unclear approach to things. If we're partnering with certain security elements and we're bolstering for, doing force multiplier effect with the Nigerian Special Forces Division in DIFA, for example, which I know was considered one of the kind of paradigms of success in terms of partner force capacity building that the US Special Forces was doing in Niger in general. But that's not being extended across the entire Ministry of Defense at the institutional level, then there's a huge gap right there in terms of how the senior security political elites are viewing what is going on with these smaller units on the ground. Same exact type of problematic approach applies, in my opinion, to doing, USAID-led governance programming at the commune level, where you build civil society capacity, but you're not exactly messaging that through diplomatic lens to political elites in the capital. I think I want to, like, I know there's been quite a bit of speaking, but I'm happy to answer more questions, but I feel like that really kind of captures what I'm trying to say in terms of lessons learned and how the US has kind of fallen victim to its own approach in many ways in West Africa.
I really appreciate that, Annalise. What I like to do is now is just kind of we'll go back through. We'll start with James, and then we'll go to Ibrahim, and then Malik, and then ending with you, Annalise. Just kind of talking through what the future holds, kind of your predictions on what happens next. And we have just a few minutes left here, so we'll start with James and then move quickly through the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Really important question, really big questions. It's kind of hard to know, kind of what the most essential truths here are, I guess, or the most kind of important takeaways would be. I guess I would really focus on the kind of the shift in U.S. policy and including that also of kind of the EU and some of our other partners from a focus on the Sahelian region to the coastal West African states. So this is something that definitely predates the coup in Niger. You had, I think, in 2019, something called the Global Fragility Act, which was passed by Congress, that designates 5 coastal West African states as kind of primary targets or beneficiaries for this kind of new, for kind of preventative programming. So kind of not so much using the frame of counterterrorism, but more, preventing and combating violent extremism, building up the resilience of these different communities to try to make them kind of more able to defend themselves better against this kind of terrorist encroachment. And so again, that kind of programming, those initiatives predate the 2023 coup in Niamey. They're grounded in a couple of different considerations. One, which is just that the Sahelian states, again, even before the coup in Niger, were already the trend lines across the broader Sahel were quite concerning. You have these violent extremist groups that were spreading and spilling into kind of coastal West Africa. That's something that I've written some Hudson studies about, and this idea that okay, maybe these coastal West African countries, because in some ways, they're maybe they have a lot of the same challenges that the Sahelian states do. They face some certain vulnerabilities, but they also have certain assets. Some of these countries, like Ghana, that has a stronger, democratic system according to State Department, and some of these countries have stronger, more vibrant economies or more diversified economies theoretically because they're linked to their coastal states. They're linked to global trade. Again, I actually think that's a bit of a simplification, but this is some of the thinking within the U.S. government. So, now we're in a position, originally the kind of the pivot towards bolstering these coastal states kind of defenses against terrorist encroachment was meant to be kind of complementary to what we were doing in Niger. And I think Aneliese has done a much better job than I could have explaining, what the thinking was and kind of how much, the very high hopes that the U.S. government placed in that model. And if that model didn't work in Niger, I think we really need to consider, okay, if the United States is now focused on trying to support these coastal states, if, whether we like it or not, people, the 3 kind of most important countries from the perspective of counterterrorism in the Sahel, that's Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. If they don't want our support for the various reasons that I think Ibrahim especially elucidated very well, okay, well, you don't have a choice, right? So you're going to focus on these coastal states. But I think that there really needs to be kind of a willingness to learn from some of the lessons and to question, okay, if things really looked good in Niger, at a superficial level, and if I think sometimes in terms of U.S. policy towards West Africa, there's kind of this bigotry of low expectations, right? Because it's not, I mean, I'm positive that there were people in the U.S. government, people like Aneliese who could point out, well, actually, not everything here is perfect. This country is not the regime is not particularly robust. It might have legitimacy problems, especially outside certain circles in Niamey. It also has its own enemies within Niamey and certain elite factions within, like Ibrahim said, the vanguard in the military and other political oppositions. But if sometimes I think those dissenting voices or those kind of that analysis can get overridden by just the kind of pragmatic concern of, yeah, well, you know, this isn't Denmark, right? Like we have to deal with what your you know, the political elites. You have to deal with the partners that you have, and so you know, and that can, I mean, there's a whole separate debate to be had on the question of human rights and accountability, and people, you know, feel very strongly about that. There's quite a debate about to what extent should the U.S. government, you know, prioritize human rights in its approach to a region like West Africa. But even setting that aside, I think just from an analytical perspective, it's very important that, you know, you can't just take the, oh, well, relative to some of these other countries, things here seem to be going well, so therefore we should just kind of, you know, keep plodding along with that approach. But I'll turn to the my co-panelists here, and I think they'll be able to hopefully provide some characteristically insightful kind of concluding thoughts on that.
Thank you. Ibrahim?
Well, thank you very much. So 2 points here. The first one is that I think one of the easy solution that people found is to say that, you know what, enough with the Sahel. This is a region that is not working. We have spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, and things have gone only wrong. Let us move to the coastal countries where we can do better work. So there is this thing that we call the exodus, you know, of the international community from the Sahel region to the coastal countries. It's not only the United States, European countries are opening new embassies in Benin, Togo. But I mean, my sense is that if the idea is that let us leave the Sahel with its problem and then move to the coastal countries and shield the coastal countries from the Sahel's problem, I think that's not going to work. We all agree with that. As long as the Sahel remain destabilized, the coastal countries are not going to be safe. So the idea that we can move from this and that and then find an easy solution, I think that is not going to work. We have to really, it is difficult in the Sahel, I think, but I don't think there is any way around engaging these military juntas to make sure that things do not get worse than they are now. But if they do, then there's not going to be safety in the coastal countries neither. Second, on Niger itself, looking forward, I do think, I mean, we're bad at predicting the future, right? But we can say that there are several scenarios that are possible. Among those, one is that, and I think the most likely one is for the junta to double down. You know, they have made all those constitutional decisions. They are working for them. I mean, look at the junta in Niger has won every single battle that it had from the beginning of the coup up to now. Everything, you know, the standoff with ECOWAS, you know, the coup first. People thought that this coup is not going to work. It worked. Standoff with France, it worked. Standoff with ECOWAS, it worked. You know, standoff with the United States worked. A win. With the public opinion in Niger, a big win. You know, everything has worked well for them so far. So I think the likely outcome is to say that, you know, this thing is working and we are going to continue to do what we have done so far. And this is. On the other side, you have other people who hope and expect that this thing collapses. You know, that there is a counter coup, that things come back to normal. You know, that they realize that international community are not going to are going to come back, and then there will be, you know, relinking. Going back, you know, to the old way of doing things, or collaborations, engagement with the Western countries rather than the Eastern countries, etc. A lot of people are hoping that this may happen, and particularly those who are on the opposite side, including within the European countries. A lot of them are thinking that, well, up to when are they going to hold? You know, what is the last when? From the beginning of the coup, people are saying that they cannot survive all the sanctions and they are going to collapse, etc. And still people today hope that, and I think this is the unlikely scenario. I think we are in this for the longer term. But they might legitimize themselves via elections, but we are likely to have these people or people who look like them, to rule over the Sahel, not only Niger, but I think the two other countries. The third scenario that I think is a hopeful one, but that's what we wish for, is that they accept a certain rebalancing, that they accept that this thing is not working. It's true that it's not working. There are a lot of difficulties. I mean, they have made people's life really difficult in all three countries. Today, we are talking about electricity cut in all three countries. People are getting only 2, 3 hours, 4 hours of electricity a day. We are talking about, the cost of living because of difficulty to bring things in Niger, for example. Closing the border with Benin has rendered goods extremely difficult to get. Inflation has gone up. A lot of difficulties in every single sector of life. So it is to say that, we can maintain this sovereignist discourse. We can maintain some of the sovereignty discourse, which is not too bad. They have succeeded in relinking people, the layman with people on power. And that's one thing that they succeed. If we can have that, but at the same time, we will soften some of the positions so that Western countries can engage, and have some form of working relationship, while both sides respect one another's position. They respect our sovereignty, but also we respect some of the things that we can have a working relationship like that. Then we can end up having, a relation that ease up people's life, and then they maintain also power. I think this is a rebalancing act, resetting of the relation with Western countries in particular. That could be really the most hopeful outcome that people in the region expect.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. And final words from Malik and then Aneliese.
Thank you. I think Ibrahim made very valid points there. And I'll just build on that to say, I think as long as the popular support, the public opinion favors junta, they like to hold on to power. But then we know that dictators usually don't do well in running the state. So I think it's only a matter of time before we see people start complaining about the things Ibrahim talked about, the cost of living, the economic situation, and all that. So when we get to that point where the Nigerians start complaining, and I think the junta will start feeling the pressure. But for now, they'll continue riding on the popular support that they get from the people. And I think another thing that works for them is that even though violent extremist groups have continued to carry out more attacks, but we're seeing infighting between these violent extremist groups, which to some extent, we're not seeing the kind of devastation that they can do if they are not fighting each other. So maybe it gets to a point where both, whether you talk about Jenim and the Islamic State affiliates in the Sahel, or maybe when they decide to stop fighting and say, look, the common enemy here is the state. Let's unite and fight and focus on the state. Then you have more problem there. But what I see as a viable solution way forward is I think it's a diplomacy from the region. It's important that ECOWAS members find a way to use back channel diplomacy, in Niger, and we saw that worked a bit when nobody was able to see the juntas. Nigeria was able to send some religious and local leaders, including the former emir, a former emir in Nigeria, who went to Niger and was able, I think, for the first time, to be granted audience by the head of the government there. So I think back channel diplomacy and pressure from within the region is important. So we cannot wait on, we cannot rely on pressure from I would say whether from the US or from Europe. I think it has to happen from within the region. That has more chances of succeeding, than relying on outsiders.
Thank you for that. Aneliese, would you like to close this out?
Yes, so I just have a couple of comments and I'll be brief. First of all, I agree with both my fellow panelists that the junta right now is clearly winning on a lot of fronts, at least in terms of what it appears to be doing. But I will say that yes, the jihadist groups are fighting each other. Right now, the jihadist groups are also fighting the juntas, all three of them in the Central Sahel, and I think that is a huge loss. I think the US could also be strategic in its approach to kind of letting the pieces fall and seeing how the response is afterwards, but that's a much more complicated and longer conversation. But there is something to be said about the fact that the CNSP has not been able to actually deploy force protection to any of the communities on the border, and that they've also been totally incapable of actually responding to jihadist threats. And furthermore, JNM has managed to move quite freely across the Tilbury to Doso region to connect with factions from the Lake Chad Basin in northwestern Nigeria. So there is a great expansion of jihadism across the sub-region because in many ways of the vacuum that was left by the French and the US and the incapacity of local forces to actually repel these threats. That said, I just want to leave out two big things. It's also important to remember, and I know this has been a little bit fall into the back of the conversation when we're talking about how the US should respond to the juntas in the region. But the Global Fragility Act it predates actually even 2019. The discussions that went into developing it started in 2017. I was actually part of a lot of those conversations at the embassy level. More so was that the US was always planning to rotate out of the Sahel. This was actually a plan that goes back to 2017 as well, for both domestic political reasons, but also for regional reasons. It made more sense to eventually downgrade to just containment. Whether one agrees with that or not, I personally don't, but that was actually the policy dating back to 2017 to go to containment and degrade both the advanced operating bases in the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel and pivot exclusively to the coastals. This included eventually fully handing over Airbase 201 in Agadez to the Nigerians. So I think there's a lot of misnomer out there about us kind of being pushed out when in fact this was actually part of the plan all along, was to leave. Obviously, we wanted to leave on better terms than we are now. Finally, the last thing I'll say is that moving forward, when the US is able to potentially restore, whether it's back channel or actually front channel diplomatic relations with the junta regimes in the Central Sahel, so not just Niger, but also Mali and Burkina Faso, I think it's important, speaking to my original points on, we're in a different era. The post-Cold War era is not, resonating anymore. And I think what needs to happen is the US, well, life-saving assistance should always continue in places like the Sahel, which are the lowest on the development index. The rest of the aid, particularly anything that is about governance or promoting defections, for example, which are inherently political efforts, it really does need to be conditioned. Russia conditions everything that it provides to these countries, and it's a little bit strange that the US, France, and Europe are not also, reinforcing more conditioned approaches to how we engage. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you so much, Aneliese, and really thank you to all of our panelists, to Ibrahim, to Malik, James. Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts on this very serious, some very serious events that are ongoing right now. For those watching at home, please stay engaged with us. Continue. You can go to hudson.org to see upcoming events that we have. If there's something that you heard today that you want to ask more about, feel free to shoot us a note. We're going to continue to keep this conversation going forward. But once again, thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned for the next one.